I'm Rick Stanley, president of the Sanford Springvale Chamber of Commerce for the last 26 years, and quite a long time, not as long as Harland's been around. But over the years, I've come to enjoy Harland's conversations, either here or at the Chamber of Commerce. He spent a lot of time down there with Faith, who was the treasurer for the Historical Society for many years, and so Harland would be in the office 4 or 5 days a week. Sometimes I had to kick him out.
Well, that was all right because it gave me an excuse to go get some
See, he still can't
donuts.
listen. He's still, but he's a great conversation, and I've learned a lot from him, and I'm sure over the years many of you have also. In celebration of Sanford's 250th anniversary this year, Sanford was incorporated in 1768. Harland will go over all that with you. We asked Harland if he would do a special presentation. The year's events to celebrate Sanford's 250th are on the Sanford City website and also on the Chamber website. Some activities continue through year in and year out. We've incorporated some of those with the city logo, the logo for the 250th, and we created some events throughout the year that we hope that will add to the celebration. We didn't want to do it all in one weekend. We wanted to give Sanford the publicity and the due it deserved throughout the year. So if you were lucky enough to show up in February on the date of the incorporation down in Sanford, we had a beautiful event down there with fireworks and the dedication of the ice rink to kick off the 250th. And so keep an eye out. Look at the sites if you don't get a chance to. Not everything ends up in the newspaper, unfortunately, but you can always find the activities on the website from now through the end of the year. So we are very pleased to have Harland Eastman.
Right there.
Yeah, I won't go anywhere. To have Harland give us this presentation tonight because it's the most important presentation. Okay. It's already got stuff for me to do.
I'm also the proctor.
Yeah. It is the most important presentation because it will give you the history of where Sanford came from 1768, and I think we all should know that. There's some great books to read in regards to that too, but nothing better than having the real guy here go over some of this tonight, so I'm sure you'll enjoy it. Harland did ask me to show that they have a summer schedule here. I do post his Historical Society events on my website as well, on a calendar. The Chamber has a really good calendar, so if you're looking for some things, you can find it on our calendar as well, but you're welcome to have one of these when you leave to keep track of some of the events. Yeah, and what's that?
I said
There's a handful of
there.
them.
And,
Yeah, okay. And then you all have a ticket tonight. And Sanford's logo, we had a logo contest started last fall, and we received artists' ideas that came in, and we fine-tuned some of that, and we came up with a 250th logo, and we put it on various items, merchandise, and we sell it at the Chamber, and the city sells it. And at our events throughout the summer and the fall, we'll have them available as well. But if you can't wait, then you can buy these. These are $10 item at the Chamber of Commerce. We're going to give away 5 of these tonight with your tickets. And then we're also going to give away, the logo is on the commemorative coin. If those of you that remember, I talked with a gentleman back here that has a handful of coins from 1968. I have one myself because I was a kid back then. And back then the merchants basically celebrated the bicentennial by having events at Goins Park and if you remember the Crazy Day sales and all the things that used to do when we actually had a good amount of merchants in the downtown. I received one of those coins as well. So we made up new coins, and we have the city of Sanford's logo, which has been incorporated in a lot of the departments, all the departments at Sanford. The Chamber has the same swish logo, and on the back we have the 250th logo that the winner got for doing this. So the logo's on everything. We have t-shirts, sweatshirts, all kinds of items. So if you want to have something that will remind you of Sanford's 250th, we probably have that. We're also taking the 250th logo and they're going on lapel pins, and we're giving them to all the seniors that are graduating from Sanford High School this year. So it's kind of neat we're doing that. So this is your night, not my night. And this could go over. I did want to mention one thing.
I was just going to suggest we have refreshments now.
I want to mention one thing. I came in the door. I know. A lot our women have some really nice perfume, really, you know, and I'm not familiar with a lot of it. So I come in the door, when I come in, I go,
Not
Exactly.
me.
I hope that's not saying, I don't want to make a joke, I don't want to say anything. But as I came down here, and had a conversation with Harland, apparently there's a family of skunks that are living down in the back down here. So that's what it is. So, enough said for me. I want to introduce, for those of you who don't know, our city's historian, Harland Eastman, who will give you a very thorough talk tonight on the history of Sanford and what it means to us today. Right, Harland?
Thank you.
Okay.
All right. I'm pleased but surprised to see so many people here tonight, and I thank you all for coming. I gave this speech truncated 3 weeks ago. The Quarters Club asked to come here and have their lunch and to hear about the history of Sanford. But I knew that no good Kiwanian could possibly last more than 20 minutes at a speech, and so I reduced what I am going to say tonight to just 20 minutes, but it's going to be refloated for the full hour, and if I talk over an hour, I will apologize in advance for doing so. How about that? I'm going to talk about 3 aspects of our history. Obviously, the first is how did it all come about? How did Sanford come to be? And there we're talking about events that took place between 1661 and 1768, which is the anniversary that we're celebrating. The next aspect of my speech is about why Springvale, during the 19th century, was the larger community within the town of Sanford. Springvale outclassed Sanford during most of the 19th century, and that's the reason why this building is here. This was built as Sanford Town Hall in 1873, not as Springvale Town Hall, at Sanford Town Hall, and it remained Sanford Town Hall until 1908, when the present building at the corner of Roberts and Main Street was built. And then, of course, how all of Springvale's glory began to be eclipsed by the arrival of Thomas Goodall. Beyond that, we'll have refreshments. Now, in 1661, a man named William Phillips, who had a sawmill in Saco but was well connected in Boston circles, made a deal with the Indian chief Llewellyn to buy a portion of land. Now, this portion of land was 8 miles square, not 8 square miles, 8 miles square. That's 64 square miles. And that amounts to approximately 41,000 acres. It was land to the inland of Wells and Kennebunk. At that time, there was no actual boundaries. Those didn't come until later. But this was recognized by the province of Massachusetts and also by Sir Ferdinando Gorges, who owned a lot of Maine, as being a legitimate transfer of title. It was wilderness at that time. You couldn't do any settling here. And actually, I think that Phillips had a limitless supply of timber in mind when he purchased it, and not the creation of a town to keep his sawmills running indefinitely. In 1676, he decided to divest himself of some of this landholding, and to 13 of his children he gave to each 1,000 acres, and to 6 other individuals he gave 1,000 acres, a total of 19,000 in all. And his hope was that maybe they could encourage settlement so that this could be a habitable community, just like the ones along the coast. Unfortunately, the French government, which at that time controlled Canada, was trying to control all of North America, and they were stirring the Indians up into a frenzy of hostilities. And in 1692, all up and down the Maine coast, there were ever so many communities that were literally wiped off the face of the map. In York, for example, there were over 100 adults murdered, and the children were all taken away and raised by the Indians. One of those children later on became the representative of the Phillipstown proprietors 2 generations later, but that's another story. Anyhow, Phillips had 3 wives, not all at the same time, I hasten to add, but people didn't necessarily live for a long time in those days. His first wife died, leaving him with, I think, 3 children. Second wife died and left him with 3 more children. And then he had a third wife who was known as Bridget Sanford. And Bridget had been married to a man named Sanford before she met Phillips, or at least before she married him. She had several children whose last names were Sanford. She became his third wife, so he acquired several stepchildren who became rather influential in the settlement of what we now know as Sanford. The possibility of creating a community here of human beings had to be left in abeyance because of the continued unsettled times. There were conflicts with the Indians down into the 1700s, but finally in 1720 they thought it was wise to do a survey of the land. And so they sent a man named Preble to come and survey the lands that were purchased by William Phillips. And I hope I could read this. Among other things, I broke my glasses yesterday, and I don't have any reading glasses. But the surveyors came back with these precise bits of information on the boundaries of Sanford. Beginning at a small pine tree standing upon the north corner of said Wells Township, and on the southwest side of said Kennebunk River, upon the north end of a rocky hill, which tree is marked on 4 sides, and from thence southwest 8 miles to a pitch pine tree marked on 4 sides, and marked with an end upon the north side, which tree standeth upon the west side of a marsh, hold on, it's another page here. And it goes on like this, okay. And runs thence northwest 8 miles to a great hemlock tree marked on 4 sides, standing 3 miles to the southwest of Bonnybeg Hills, and runs thence northeast 8 miles to a great white oak tree marked on 4 sides, etc., etc. You know, it's pretty clear. And that's what they had to go on. It amazes me that Sanford ever got created, frankly. But anyhow, in the 1730s, they finally decided that hostilities weren't over, but it might be safe to try and encourage people to come and settle this land. The people who were involved primarily were the grandchildren of the 19 people to whom William Phillips gave 1,000 acres each back in 1676. They met, they drew up terms, and finally they assigned the responsibility of finding suitable settlers in the hands of one Moulton, who was the one who actually found the people to persuade them to come here and signed the deeds to them. In 1739, the very first people began to appear on the Sanford scene. Between 1739 and 1745, there were about 50 families that came. Now, there were conditions upon being granted land in Sanford, and those conditions are the same in all of the deeds. We own one of those deeds, and it was a deed that was assigned to James Chadbourne, and his land was at the area of Elm Street today in the Mousom River. And the Chadbournes lived on that land for quite a long time, in fact, and they had a gristmill too. But these were the conditions that they had to fulfill in order to get 130 acres of land, which was part of this 19,000 acres. What they did, they carved up the 19,000 acres into lots of land of 50 acres and 80 acres, but each potential settler would be offered one of each, which would be adjacent to each other. So they were really getting 130 acres. But in order to obtain permanent legal title to that land, they had to fulfill these requirements. And these were the conditions. Providing that the said James Chadbourne build a house on the aforesaid home lot, 18-foot square and 7-foot stud, and fence in 5 acres of land within 3 years from the date hereof, and dwell there for 7 years, war only excepted. But in case of war with the Indians, then the said James Chadbourne shall settle his family and live there within 3 years after the conclusion of a peace, and 7 years thereafter. So in other words, in the case of Sanford, there were no problems with the Indians after 1739. So those who came had 3 years to clear 5 acres of the 130, and to build a house of a certain size within the first 3 years, and then remain here for another 7 years, total of 10 years. And if they did that, then they would get clear legal title to their 130 acres. And it worked. Pretty soon there were about 50 families by 1750 when they first applied to the Massachusetts court for incorporation. There were about 50 families in Sanford, and obviously that included children, so there might have been 100 people. That petition went nowhere for some reason. They applied again in 1756, and that one went nowhere. By that time there were more people here, but still it wasn't a huge colony. In 1768, they finally struck pay dirt. It went through the legislature, it went up to the governor for signature and approval, and it just happened that the deputy governor of Massachusetts was a man named William Hutchinson. Hutchinson was married to Peleg Sanford's granddaughter. And the third most important person in the Massachusetts government was the Secretary of the Province, Andrew Oliver, and he was married to another of Peleg Sanford's granddaughters. In other words, their wives were sisters. And so obviously, they're the ones that put the pressure on the governor to change the name from Phillipstown, whoever heard of Phillips, to Peleg to honor their grandfather, their wife's great-grandfather, who was the governor of Rhode Island. Very important man, obviously. And so when the charter came back, people of Phillipstown discovered that they were no longer Phillipstown. They were the citizens of Sanford. Now, why was it significant to become incorporated? As a village with no incorporation status, they couldn't have selectmen, they couldn't have taxes. Maybe this sounds good, I don't know. But anyhow, there were a lot of things they couldn't do which they thought they should be doing. But as an incorporated town, they could have taxes, believe it or not. Wasn't that wonderful? And they could have selectmen, and they could be represented in the Massachusetts General Court. I should hasten to point out that they were rather frugal, however, and unless they thought there was something really germane to Sanford going on in the Massachusetts legislature, they didn't bother to spend any money sending anybody. But that may have been true at later years as well. But you know, one of the early citizens of Sanford was a man named Samuel Nason, one of whose descendants, his grandson, was the man who left the money for Nason College. He was selected in, 1789, to go to Massachusetts and vote on whether or not to ratify the Constitution. And he gave a number of rousing speeches against it and voted against it. So we can't say that Sanford was strongly behind the creation of our constitutional rights, but that's another matter. He meant well. So that is how it all came about. But you know, William Phillips, when he married Bridget Sanford, he married into the hoi polloi of Massachusetts, let me tell you, because she was born Bridget Hutchinson. Now, the Hutchinsons really were the hoi polloi. Her father and mother came over, and she was a follower of John Cotton, who was considered to be a rabble-rouser as far as the Puritan divines in Massachusetts were concerned. And they threw Bridget's mother out twice, but that didn't deter them. The Hutchinsons continued to prosper. They had mansions all over Boston, and eventually one of the grandchildren became the deputy governor of Massachusetts, and within about 3 years succeeded and became the last royal governor of Massachusetts, William Hutchinson. And his brother-in-law, Andrew Oliver, was again one of the very wealthy people in Massachusetts. Unfortunately, they picked the wrong side, and as Tories they went back to England, and in the 1800s they are litigating through John Holmes of Alford, the lawyer, for land rights that they owned as a result of this 8 square miles that their ancestor purchased from the Indians in 1661. There was a lot of conflict over land in Alford and also particularly in Lyman. And in the early 1800s, they were trying to get the squatters off so they could sell the land to people who might pay. So much for all of that. Have you any questions at this point? If you don't, I will move on to phase 2. Yes?
The Malton that you mentioned that was responsible for bringing settlers into the Sanford area, is that the same Malton that used to operate a lumber mill and stuff down in South Sanford?
Well, descendants of him. He never came to live in Sanford himself, although he was granted some acreage here. But he lived in York, and he never came to live in Sanford. But the Moultons around Sanford were pretty much his descendants. Okay, now, the next thing I wanted to talk about was Springvale as a factor in the development of Sanford. From 1739, when the first settlers came here, and 1829, there were absolutely no factories along the Mousam River anywhere between Mousam Lake and the Atlantic Ocean. In 1829, all that changed because Ichabod Frost in Springvale, who owned practically all of Springvale, it was his farm, made a deal, first of all, with some out-of-state developers who wanted to create a print works along the Mousam River where there was good water power, and that happened. They built it right next to the spring. Some of you remember the bubbling spring on Bridge Street that used to keep all the people healthy here? That was before the parking lot above it got repaved, and then it became contaminated. But we won't go into that sad loss. The factory was right there, right near the bubbling spring. It wasn't a big thing. It only employed, I think, 50 people. It printed designs on cotton cloth. It was called the print works, but it didn't print, newspapers or anything like that. It was the print works in the textile industry. And this is a true story. At the end of the prayer, and they had a minister come from New Hampshire to properly inaugurate this wonderful factory, somebody asked him, now that this part of Sanford has this wonderful factory, shouldn't this part of Sanford have its own name? And whether he was forewarned or caught off guard, anyhow, he rose to the occasion, and he said, well, we're right beside a bubbling spring, and we're in a valley between one ridge and another ridge. What about Springvale? And it caught on. And that is how Springvale got its name. And from that time on, this part of Sanford has always been known as Springvale. Now, the next factory that was established on the Mousom River was on Mill Street in Springvale, and it was the Springvale Cotton Mill. It was quite a large factory, and they, when they were doing well, they had a lot of employees. They were up and down in their ability to keep people employed, but still, it was a major, major factory. And by the 1860s, the manufacture of shoes took over, and before too long, Bridge Street, in particular, was lined with shoe factories. There was also one on Mill Street, which continued to produce shoes right down into the 1900s, but most of them were on Bridge Street and as it curved around into Pleasant Street opposite the Free Baptist Church. At one time, as many as 1,000 people were employed in the shoe factories of Springvale. And so that is the reason why Springvale grew. Sanford, by the same token, consisted of a crossroads, which was called Sanford Corner, a couple of stores, and about 3 dozen houses, and that was Sanford. And the only industry down there when Thomas Goodall arrived in 1867 was a small felt factory, just a one-story building. It was very small and very insignificant. So Springvale had not only the factories, the population grew, the stores were all in Springvale, the doctors, the lawyers, the dentists, other professional people were in Springvale. And so when Sanford needed a new town hall, they had one down opposite Robert Street or opposite Dunkin' Donuts, but unfortunately it was caving in, and it reached the point where they decided they had to build anew. And since everything practically was in Springvale, they built the town hall right here. This is the building. Interestingly, as an aside, the man who built this building was named Edmund Goodwin. And Edmund Goodwin had a sawmill up where Ted's Fried Clams is located today. And the barn, one of the barns that was part of his sawmill, is still right across the street from Ted's Fried Clams. You'll see it. It's got a date on the front of it that is incorrect. It says 1886. We have a book printed in 1880 with a picture of it, and it was right in that picture, so it has to be 1880 or earlier, but that's beside the point. I get annoyed when I see incorrect dates. But anyhow, what I find particularly interesting is that the house next door was built by his son, Edmund E. Goodwin. And that is a beautiful house. We own it, as you may know. And it was built in 1899 by Edmund E., the son of Edmund. And Edmund E. was a prominent local businessman. He had a factory for the production of clothing. He had the biggest store in town about where our beautiful district courthouse is located. And in that store, you could buy virtually anything. I refer to it as the 1880s Walmart of Springvale. But that is not what I was going to talk about. Springvale overshadowed Sanford until Thomas Goodall arrived. He came in 1867. He is an interesting person. You may know all about him. But he was born in England. His father died when he was 6 months old, His mother died when he was less than 3 years old, so he was an orphan from that age. Aunts and uncles took care of him until he was 9. Well, they continued to take care of him, but at the age of 9, having at that point never been to school, he never did go to school, they apprenticed him to a woolen mill there in Yorkshire, where he worked 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, from the age of 9. And at the age of 18, he was finally free of that obligation. At the age of 17, he was the manager of the factory. Now, this is a boy who never went to school, who taught himself to read and write. And at 17, he was the manager of the factory, still earning the salary of an apprentice, which was pennies. At the age of 18, he was free of the apprenticeship, and he left very happy, and he had 2 shillings to show for 9 years' work. That was about 50 cents. He tried to make a name for himself in England as an industrialist over the next 4 years, and he wasn't getting anywhere, so he came to America, immediately found work. With his skills, he had no difficulty working for a woolen mill in Massachusetts. A friend of his, with wife and some small children, arrived about a year after he started to work in, I think it was South Hadley. And the man was desperate for an immediate job to support his family. And Thomas let him have his job and went to Rhode Island to work for a year, and then came back to Massachusetts. And then he did something which was very sensible. He fell in love with the daughter of the owner of the factory where he was working. Now, that can be very beneficial. They got married, and what do you know? Within a year or so, young Thomas and his wife settled in Troy, New Hampshire, where he was now the owner of a woolen mill. And it produced blankets, and it was, you know, a good, steady going business. But in the mid-1850s, and this is apparently a true story too, I only like true stories, you know, he saw a man trying to get a blanket over the back of a horse and tie it on or strap it on, and the wind was blowing it off, and he thought to himself, if I were to design a blanket with straps and buckles and so forth at various places that you could put over the back of a horse and just strap it under the neck and under the belly, I bet it would sell. So he designed the first horse blanket ever made in America. And they did sell. There was a time in the late 1850s when the whole country was in a depression, and in those years he continued to make horse blankets, and he swapped them for food to pay his employees because he didn't have cash. And finally, that recession ended, and by the early part of the 1860s, he was back to full production, and in the course of producing horse blankets, his first major customer was the Union Army. And we all know what happened in 1861. The Union Army, of course, expanded. It exploded in size. And they wanted every horse blanket that Thomas Goodall could provide them. He went on a 24-hour-a-day production schedule, working by lamplight, producing horse blankets for the Union Army. It is said that every Union horse had at least one Thomas Goodall blanket. I don't know whether that's true, but that's what is said. At the end of the Civil War, Thomas Goodall was a very rich man. And he was only in his middle to late 30s. So he decided he would go back to England and live the life of a gentleman. Now, he and his wife had just had a baby girl. And she said, Thomas, I'm not going to go to England with a baby on tempestuous seas. I'm staying right here. I'll join you in a year when the baby is older. Their 3 sons, Louis, George, and Ernest, were in a military boarding school in Vermont, so they were sort of out of the picture in terms of necessary care. Thomas, therefore, went to England by himself. And within a year, the family was able to join him, but also within a year he was bored to tears. He'd never in his life from the time he was 9 years old not had something to do. And so he was already thinking about returning to the United States, and that is what he did the following year in 1867. He came back and heard that the little felt mill on Washington Street in Sanford could be purchased. So he came to Sanford and talked with the owner, but he decided the owner wanted too much money. And so he got a man named Clark to take him by wagon back to Wells to get the train, and that could take him back to Troy, New Hampshire, where we still owned his home. And he told Clark about his disappointment, and Clark said, well, you know, my family owns the next dam up. We have a sawmill on it, and the next dam down is our grist mill. We'll sell you our water power if you want to come here, and we'll make it right with you. So he came back the following week and struck a deal with the Clark family and bought those two. And when the owner of the felt mill found out what had happened, he came down on his price, and Thomas in the same week purchased all 3 dam sites. And so at the beginning, the first thing that Thomas did was to take the little felt mill, which is only 1 story high, and turn it into a 3.5-story building. Now, he was able to do this very quickly because he owned the sawmill right in the next dam. And he continued to expand. And he encouraged his 3 boys. In 1867, his boys were only 15 and 13, but by 1872, when the 2 older boys, twins, were 21 and the younger boy was 19, he encouraged them to build their own factory. You can do it. He bought a dam at Emory Street, which was sort of dilapidated. It had run a grist mill for a while, but it was not active. Anyhow, he bought that and made it available to his sons. Knowing Thomas, I think he made them pay for it. But they got the capital together and they built what was called the Mousen River Mills between 1872 and 1875. And it prospered. And we're particularly aware of that endeavor because about 15 years ago, we were able to purchase all of the records of the building of that factory between 1872 and 1875, over 2,000 documents. Everything from the hay for horses to clear the land, the digging of the foundations, the colors of the paints, the machinery, every detail is covered in those records. And we have them all in 18 volumes. And when we finish here, if you can tear yourself away from the table of goodies, there are some of the albums on display in this pair of rooms over here. This whole exhibit, by the way, is about the arrival of Thomas Goodall in Sanford 151 years ago. The development of Sanford, thanks to Thomas Goodall, was not a spectacular increase. When he arrived in 1867, the total population of Sanford was 2,300, roughly. In 1883, which was a very important year in the history of the mills, the total population of Sanford was 2,700. Now, what was this important development? When Thomas was in England, he became aware of a material known as mohair plush. Mohair is the wool of the Angora goat. And the Brits had figured out how to weave this very silky, very difficult to control wool into wonderful, lustrous material, which they call plush. And Thomas tried to get in to see how these mills worked, and they said no way. They recognized that he was an industrial spy. But 2 years later, his son George, who really didn't want to get into the manufacture of woolen products, He was more interested in becoming an artist. He did beautiful paintings. He went to Europe with Maine's foremost artists to study. And while he was in England, 19 years old, just a kid, you know, he got in to see how these looms worked. They didn't recognize him as an industrial spy, which of course he was, a successful one. It took him 10 years with the aid of a mechanic to finally produce a loom that would work with mohair. And once he had achieved that, he had a loom manufacturer come and make 25 copies of it. In 1883, they were ready to go into the production of mohair plush. And to give you an idea of what that meant to the history of Sanford, in 1883, the population of Sanford was 2,700. In 1910, it was 9,000. 3,000 people worked at the Goodall mills, thanks to mohair plush. It was used for upholstery material. For many, many years, all the Pullman cars in America were upholstered in nothing but mohair plush from Sanford mills. The material was used for draperies, to upholster furniture in homes, and to make carriage robes, which were extremely important for survival in the New England weather. Wagons and sleighs were used in those days for transportation, but they didn't have any heat. So carriage robes were a big seller. And thanks to George and his artistic abilities, in the 1890s, their catalog of carriage robes had 450 different designs. And even after 1900, when the automobile began to appear, the early automobiles didn't have any windows. A lot of them never had any roofs. It wasn't until, I think, about 15 or 20 that they had any heat. And so you continued to need blankets to keep warm if you were going to go for a drive. In fact, up until about 1910 or 15, most people who were rich enough to own cars would put them up on stilts during the wintertime and get the horse out. And that was true right here in Sanford and Springvale. So anyhow, the Goodall mills flourished. There was another product that came to be in the early 1900s, which was actually the patent of one of their top employees, William Nutter, and that was known as Palm Beach. Palm Beach is a very lightweight suit material, and it became popular early on. They would sell the material to suit manufacturers, some of whom produced very nice suits, some of whom produced rather shoddy suits. And the Goodalls began to get blamed for the quality of the tailoring and not for the quality of the material. And so they decided that they wouldn't sell their Palm Beach to any suit manufacturer anymore. They would produce the suits themselves. They were, to some extent, produced in Sanford, but they created a factory on the outskirts of Cincinnati, and that's where most of these suits were made. The Goodall mills expanded. You know, this is going pretty well. We may get through here before I pass out. How about that? By the way, I hasten to point out to any of you who may think that I was not an eyewitness to anything that I've been talking about tonight. I'm old, but I'm not that old. The development of the mills into this century, of course, continued. In the late 20s and early 30s, the differential between wages here in Sanford and wages in the southern states was considerable. And so the expansion of the Goodall mills after the mid-20s was not here in Sanford, it was in the South. They owned several factories in the South that they purchased. In addition to, in the 20s, the factory in Cincinnati for the making of suits. They were very conscious of what they could do with the wages that they were paying. The Goodalls paid very well, As a result, home ownership in Sanford was extremely high for an industrial town. And when the mills finally closed, the population of Sanford did not go into a decline as far as the worker force was concerned. The mill bosses, the managers and so forth, had to look elsewhere for employment because there really wasn't anything close by that they could go to. But most of the working families found employment that they could go to by automobile at Portsmouth or Portland or in some nearby place. And as a result, the population of Sanford did not take a nosedive. The family continued to own the mills. Thomas Goodall lived until 1910, but by the middle of the 1880s, he turned everything over to his 3 sons. He had 2 daughters, but both daughters died at the age of 4 and actually never saw each other. So his descendants were the 3 sons. George, the artist, married a lady named Henrietta, and it was Henrietta who persuaded George to take an interest in public health. And after she died, he built the Henrietta de Goodall Hospital in her memory. Ernest was a jack of all trades. He's a remarkable man. He was married just briefly, but basically he was a bachelor all his life. He was a bon vivant. He had cottages on Great East Lake and on Mousab Lake, and he had a summer home down near Daytona Beach and also at Palm Beach in Florida. He had his yacht in Florida where he went around catching alligators and all of those things. And we have one wonderful picture of Ernest entertaining people from the city at his cottage on Great East Lake. This is during the time of Prohibition. And I count 11 whiskey bottles on the various pieces of furniture. I used that picture once in a Rotary calendar, and I think my label read something like, Ernest Goodall and Friends Suffering Through Prohibition. Anyhow, one of the things that Ernest did, what I thought was remarkable, he was the one who created the electric railroads here in Sanford. In 1893, there was a trolley line between Sanford Springvale squares, and there was a dip that went into the mill yard in Sanford for freight, and this was very successful from the beginning. It went along Pleasant Street and River Street, and in order to power that very small bit of electric rail, he put a dam in about where the YMCA is located today, which is still there, not being used for anything, but it's still there. And it provided the power needed by what was called the Mousam River Railroad between Sanford and Springvale. And it was about that time that the mills began to convert from water power to coal, burning of coal for power. And getting coal from wherever it was being extracted from the ground, Pennsylvania and other places, was expensive. It came by rail, of course. And he thought if we could get a rail line from Sanford down to the shore, we could bring coal in by ship at a fraction of what it's costing to bring it here on freight cars. And so he created the Sanford and Cape Papas Railroad, which went obviously down to Cape Papas. Even you figured that one out, didn't you? Now, how to power that? He built a dam at Old Falls that powered the Sanford to Cape Papas Railroad. And then he got carried away and decided I might as well own all the trolley cars in York County, and he bought them up and created the Atlantic Shoreline Railroad. But he wanted to provide all the power for that too. So he dammed Estes Lake. There's a 1,000-foot-long dam that creates Estes Lake. That was the power for the Atlantic Shoreline Railroad. And he himself constructed that dam. He had a hut there supervising the construction of that 1,000-foot dam, and it's still producing electric power today. And what is particularly remarkable, these York County electric railroads were the only ones in America that had their own source of electricity. There were no others anywhere else. He was a bon vivant, and when he built the Sanford Trust Company, he added a top floor, which was the Sanford Town Club. I often wondered whether, when he built the Sanford Trust Company, if it wasn't pleasing to him because it blocked his view of the Sanford National Bank, which was his brother Louis's bank. But we don't know that for sure. Anyhow, Ernest was a remarkable man. He inherited the Goodall mansion. He transformed it from the Italianate facade that it had at the beginning to a colonial facade, and in our exhibit you can see pictures of the before and after. That happened actually in 1909 while his father and mother were still alive. And they obviously must have approved because they owned the house. He only inherited it the following year. And both of his parents died. I think the mother died in February 1910, and he died in May 1910. And we do have something from him. We have his death mask. It's in one of the showcases, and it was used, I understand, by the sculptor who created the Goodall statue that is now in the park at Central Square. You'll love the box. It was obviously a recycled box. In various places it says, "Glass, beware, handle with care," and all these admonitions, and at the bottom down here it says, "Ladies' aprons." I have that on display too. I like that. Anyhow, Ernest inherited the Goodall mansion. When he died, he left it to the three children of his brother Louis. But Thomas M Goodall, the grandson of the first Thomas Goodall, bought his two sisters out and became the sole owner of the house early on. He was extremely wealthy. He called up the Rolls-Royce agency in Boston in the early 20s and said he would like to see what the new Rolls-Royce was like. Could they send somebody up with one of them to demonstrate it? Well, the Rolls-Royce agency in Boston had no idea who this Thomas M. Goodall was, so they sent the junior salesman up with a Rolls-Royce, and he came back with an order for 3. You know, one might run out of gas. You got to have an extra one, you know. And Rolls-Royces were the choice of the family for a long time. We have all the correspondence between Louis B. Goodall and his son-in-law, Campbell, between the mid-1920s and well into the 1930s. And at one point, Campbell's wife, who was Louis's daughter, had a cough that just persisted right through the fall season. And Louis, in his letter to Campbell, said, "Well, why don't you have her come right after Christmas and spend some weeks out here with our wonderful climate and dry air? It'll probably clear up her cough. And tell her not to worry about transportation, because her sister will be getting her new Rolls-Royce at Christmas, and she can drive her old Rolls-Royce while she's here." You know, it was all very nice. I'm not going to talk on. I said I was going to end this in an hour, and I think it must be just about that. I would be glad to answer questions, but if you've got some and you can yell them, I might possibly hear what you're saying. Yes?
I've heard, too, that part of the demise of Springvale was a fire in the 1900s. Is that true, or was there a fire?
No, it's not true. Springvale burned in 1905, and it was a disastrous fire. All the shoe factories, except the little one on Mill Street, burned. And the town really did suffer. The whole business area was gone. All the shoe factories were gone. Within a year, it had been rebuilt. And, but as a token of local sentiment, when Springvale burned, guess what? Sanford petitioned the legislature to separate itself from Springvale because they were concerned about having to pay for any of the cost of rebuilding Springvale after the fire. It was turned down by the legislature, not for any good reason, except that the predominant party of Sanford at that time, which would have been another representative in Augusta, was of the wrong party. It was turned down for that reason. And then, earlier on, the question of schooling became an issue between the two towns. There were lots of little local schools all over the place. There were 20 of them, in fact. They, as transportation improved in this century, they became less and less. But as far as high school was concerned, in 1873, the state legislature passed a law that any town of a certain size had to provide so many weeks of high school education. And so the town of Sanford appropriated $500 to create a high school. That included all the funds that they might need for desks and chairs and everything else. This building right here was the first Sanford High School. It was in the fall term, and in the spring term there was a school in the vicinity of Sanford Square, it doesn't exist any longer, that was used for the spring course. The following year, the town really got carried away and appropriated $400 and said, yes, you can have high school for another year. And the following year, they really got carried away and they appropriated $250. And so that was the last year of a high school. From that point on, for 10 straight years, even though the law required it, state law required it, no money was appropriated in Sanford for a high school. It wasn't until 1888, when they again turned down a high school, that Ernest Goodall got up and said, if you won't fund a high school, I will. And he gave the money necessary to start another high school. And it had the desired effect. It embarrassed the town fathers into doing something at long last. And they immediately built a new school building on School Street. It's now the vacant lot next to the Sanford Post Office, but it was then called the Longfellow School. That was Sanford's first high school. There was a school building, just a grade school building, on the site, and S.B. Emery bought it and moved it over to Washington Street, and it became the front end of S.B. Emery's store, if any of you remember that. So from that point on, Sanford had a high school. And guess what? Springvale was not to be left behind. Springvale had to have a high school too. So in 1889, Springvale had a high school. And in 1911, the Sanford authorities decided that it could not afford two high schools. And so guess what? It closed Springvale High School. And there was a terrible uproar. And Springvale petitioned the legislature to separate itself from Sanford so that it could have its own high school. And for the very same reason, it got turned down, because whatever party was in power here in Springvale was not the one that was in power in Augusta, so they got turned down. And so it went back and forth. And finally, in 1917, thanks to the generosity of, I can't remember his name, a very prominent Sanford lawyer, he owned the land where the Willard School stands. That is exactly equidistant between Springvale Square and Sanford Square. And he offered it to the town for a new high school. And that's where the high school was built, and it was the high school down for another 50 years. And it's a wonderful building. And I certainly hope that our town fathers don't sweep it away when they close it, because it would be a tragedy. Yes?
Yes, Harland, you know, did Goodall obtain U.S. citizenship, or did he stay a British citizen?
You do. She yelled at me. I'm not kidding.
Did Goodall attain U.S. citizenship, or did he stay a British citizen? Okay, I'm just going back and forth.
It was easier. And in fact, that one trip back to Thomas Goodall was the only time he ever went back. Louis became a world traveler, and he and one of his daughters traveled all over the world. I don't recall that Ernest ever went abroad. He might have. And George went abroad to study twice. And he really, it was beautiful pictures. He was a fine artist. It's a shame he didn't continue. But on the other hand, He was in charge of the color part of the Goodall production and was responsible for the gorgeous fabrics that they produced, including, of course, the carriage ropes. All right, what is it? My God, it's exactly 8 o'clock. Yes, monsieur.
Thank you, Harland. Usually I let him more than 2 words before people start talking. When Thomas Goodall was apprenticed at a mill in Yorkshire, did he learn one specific task of the process, or did he learn a number, or all of them?
All of them. He was the overall manager of the factory.
In 17?
He knew every part of the function of producing woolen material. We had tremendous skill when he came to America. And probably his father was all right back there. And I'm happy that that was married into the family.
Thank you.
And out in the front hall, I pictured of the Goodalls, and over on the left, if you're facing the doors from this direction, there are 2 old pictures. And those are Thomas Goodall symbols. What is that? Oh my God, I made that. All right, I think that's fine. There are sumptuous goodies.
Well, we have a few surprises starting off with the raffle. And you want to know?
I didn't know if Howard wanted to, I don't want to put him on the spot, but maybe you could
Well, first
introduce your board of directors.
we have to give some applause.